Man saves grizzly bear cub from thirst. What happened next shocked everyone. The massive grizzly bear stood just 15 feet away from Jake Harrison, her amber eyes burning with protective fury. Behind her, the tiny cub he had saved 3 months ago peered out from between her massive legs. Jake's heart pounded as he realized the truth. This wasn't just any wild bear. This was the mother he thought would never return. And what happened next would change everything we think we know about the bond between humans and one of nature's most feared predators. But to understand this incredible moment, we need to go back to where it all began, on a scorching July morning in the Montana wilderness that would test one man's courage and compassion in ways he never imagined. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications to catch more heartwarming stories like this one. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Jake Harrison had been a wildlife photographer for over 15 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he'd discovered that sweltering July morning in Glacier National Park. The 38-year-old from Denver had woken up at 4 a.m., driven 3 hours into the backcountry, and hiked another 2 miles to reach his favorite spot overlooking the Blackfoot River Valley. The temperature was already climbing past 95 degrees, unusual for Montana even in the height of summer. Climate change had been pushing these extreme weather patterns further north, and the wildlife was suffering. Jake had come here to document the effects of the drought on the local ecosystem, but what he found would turn this routine assignment into something far more personal. It was around 8 a.m. when he first heard it, a weak, pitiful crying that seemed to echo off the canyon walls. At first, Jake thought it might be a bird, maybe an injured hawk or eagle, but as he followed the sound, adjusting his telephoto lens and moving carefully through the underbrush, the cries became more distinct, more mammalian. "That's not a bird," he whispered to himself, his camera hanging heavy around his neck as he pushed through a thicket of huckleberry bushes. And then he saw it. Nestled against a fallen log, barely visible beneath a small overhang of rock, was a grizzly bear cub no bigger than a golden retriever puppy. Its chocolate-brown fur was matted and dirty, and its tiny black nose was dry and cracked from dehydration. The cub's breathing was shallow and rapid, classic signs of heat exhaustion. Jake's first instinct was to back away. Every wilderness safety course he'd ever taken screamed the same message: never ever approach a bear cub. Where there's a cub, there's always a protective mother nearby, and a mama grizzly defending her young is one of the most dangerous encounters you can have in the wild. But as Jake scanned the surrounding area through his telephoto lens, he realized something was terribly wrong. There was no sign of the mother, no massive paw prints in the dusty earth, no broken branches from a large animal moving through the forest, no scent markings on the nearby trees. The cub was completely alone. For 20 minutes, Jake waited and watched from a safe distance of about 200 yards. The little bear's cries grew weaker and weaker. Its tiny paws scratched feebly at the dry earth, searching for moisture that simply wasn't there. The nearest water source was the river, almost a mile away, down a steep, rocky slope that would be impossible for such a small cub to navigate. Jake found himself facing an agonizing decision. Every instinct told him to maintain his distance, to let nature take its course. But as he watched through his camera lens, zooming in on the cub's face, he saw something that would haunt him forever. The same look of desperate hope he'd seen in the eyes of lost children during his early career as a photojournalist covering humanitarian crises. "Come on, Jake," he muttered to himself, lowering his camera. "You can't just watch this happen." The internal battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. He thought about his daughter Emma back home in Denver, how she'd react if she knew he'd let a baby animal die when he could have helped. He thought about his late wife Sarah, who'd always said that compassion was never the wrong choice, even when it was the dangerous one. But he also thought about the very real possibility that the mother might return at any moment, and how she'd react to finding a human near her cub. Adult grizzlies can run up to 35 miles per hour and have a bite force of over 1,200 pounds per square inch. Even for an experienced outdoorsman like Jake, it could be a death sentence. The cub's cries were getting so weak now that Jake had to strain to hear them over the wind rustling through the pine trees. The little bear had stopped moving almost entirely, lying on its side with its tongue hanging out, panting in the shade of the rock overhang. That's when Jake made the decision that would change both their lives forever. Moving slowly and deliberately, Jake began his approach. He kept his camera ready, partly out of professional habit, but mostly because he wanted to document what might be his final moments. If something happened to him out here, at least the photos would tell the story of what he was trying to do. Every step felt like it took an eternity. The dry pine needles and broken twigs seemed to crunch louder than thunder under his hiking boots. Jake found himself holding his breath, listening for any sound that might indicate the mother's return. The snap of a branch, the rumble of a low growl, the heavy footfalls of a 400-pound apex predator. But the forest remained eerily quiet, except for the cub's labored breathing. When Jake was about 50 feet away, the little bear noticed him for the first time. Instead of fear, Jake saw something that broke his heart: relief. The cub tried to lift its head, tried to crawl toward him, but barely had the strength to move. "Hey there, little one," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you're scared. I'm scared too, but we're gonna get through this together, okay?" He moved from the side, moving in a wide arc to avoid appearing threatening. Jake had photographed enough wildlife to understand basic animal body language. Direct approaches could be interpreted as predatory behavior. He kept his movements slow and predictable, talking in a calm, soothing voice the entire time. The cub's dark brown eyes followed his every movement. Up close, Jake could see just how desperate the situation had become. The cub's gums were pale pink instead of the healthy dark color they should be. Its nose was completely dry, and when Jake gently touched the loose skin on the cub's neck, it took several seconds to snap back into place, a clear sign of severe dehydration. "You poor little guy," Jake whispered, carefully setting down his camera bag. "Where's your mama? How long have you been out here alone?" From his pack, he pulled out his water bottle, a 32-ounce stainless steel container that he always kept full during his wilderness expeditions. The water was warm from the heat, but it was clean and fresh. He'd filled it that morning from a mountain spring about 5 miles north. The challenge now was getting the water into the cub without causing more stress or injury. Jake had once volunteered at a wildlife rehabilitation center in Colorado, and he remembered the basics of caring for dehydrated animals. Small amounts given frequently were better than trying to force large quantities all at once. He poured a small amount of water into his cupped palm and held it near the cub's muzzle. The cub's nostrils flared as it caught the scent of the water, and its tongue darted out weakly to lap at Jake's hand. "That's it," Jake encouraged softly. "Nice and slow. Easy does it." For the next hour, Jake sat cross-legged in the dirt next to the bear cub, patiently offering small amounts of water every few minutes. Gradually, the little bear began to show signs of improvement. Its breathing became less labored, its tongue wasn't hanging out quite as far, and it was able to lift its head more easily. But even as the cub grew stronger, Jake knew this was just the beginning of their problems. The little bear might be able to survive another day or two with the water Jake could provide, but it couldn't survive on its own in the wild. At probably only 8 to 10 weeks old, it was still completely dependent on its mother's milk and protection. The big question was, where was she? As Jake sat there in the oppressive heat, sharing his water with an orphaned grizzly bear, he began to piece together what might have happened. This year's drought had been particularly severe. Water sources that had flowed for decades were completely dry. Food sources that bears typically relied on, berries, fish, and small game, were becoming increasingly scarce. It was possible that the mother had left the cub in what she thought was a safe spot, while she went to search for food or water. In normal circumstances, this would be typical behavior. Mother bears often leave their cubs hidden while they forage, returning every few hours to nurse and check on them. But with water sources so far away and food so scarce, it was possible that the mother had been forced to travel much farther than usual. She might have encountered other bears at a distant water source and been forced to fight for access. She might have been injured or even killed by a larger male bear. It was possible that the mother had left the cub in what she thought was a safe spot while she went to search for food or water. In normal circumstances, this would be typical behavior. Mother bears often leave their cubs hidden while they forage, returning every few hours to nurse and check on them. But with water sources so far away and food so scarce, it was possible that the mother had been forced to travel much farther than usual. She might have encountered other bears at a distant water source and been forced to fight for access. She might have been injured or even killed by a larger male bear, which sometimes happens during mating season or when resources are scarce. Or, and this was the possibility that Jake tried not to think about, she might have simply abandoned the cub because she knew she couldn't produce enough milk to keep it alive in these drought conditions. It was a heartbreaking reality of wildlife survival that even devoted mothers sometimes had to make impossible choices. As the afternoon sun began to sink lower in the sky, Jake realized he was facing an impossible decision of his own. He couldn't leave the cub here to die, but he also couldn't take it with him. Removing a wild animal from its natural habitat was not only illegal under federal law, it could result in years in prison and hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines, but it would also almost certainly be a death sentence for the bear in the long run. Grizzly cubs who are raised by humans rarely survive when released back into the wild. They lose their natural fear of humans, which makes them dangerous to people and, ultimately, leads to the bears being euthanized by wildlife officials. It was a lose-lose situation that Jake had seen play out tragically many times in his career documenting wildlife. But as he looked down at the little bear, now curled up against his leg and breathing more easily thanks to the water he'd provided, Jake knew he couldn't just walk away. The hike back to his truck took Jake twice as long as usual. Every few hundred yards, he had to stop and give the cub more water. The little bear was stronger now, but still far too weak to make the journey on its own. Jake had fashioned a makeshift carrier from his camera bag, padding it with his spare shirt and jacket. The cub seemed to understand that Jake was trying to help. It didn't struggle or try to escape from the improvised carrier. Instead, it looked up at Jake with those dark, trusting eyes and occasionally made small, chittering sounds that almost sounded like gratitude. "I know, little guy," Jake said during one of their rest stops, gently stroking the cub's head with one finger. "I don't know what we're going to do either, but we'll figure something out." By the time they reached Jake's pickup truck, the sun was setting behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Under normal circumstances, Jake would have been setting up his camera to capture the golden hour light. Instead, he was cradling a grizzly bear cub and trying to figure out how to save its life without destroying both their futures. He called the Montana Fish Wildlife Park's emergency hotline from his satellite phone. The conversation didn't go well. "Sir, you need to return that animal to exactly where you found it immediately. It's illegal to possess wildlife, and interfering with natural processes can have serious ecological consequences." "I understand the law," Jake replied, looking down at the cub nestled in his passenger seat. "But this animal was dying of dehydration. The mother is nowhere to be found. If I hadn't intervened, it would be dead by now." "That may be the natural outcome, sir. As difficult as it is to accept, wildlife mortality is part of the ecological balance. We cannot save every individual animal." Jake felt his frustration rising. "So you're telling me to take this cub back out there and let it die?" "I'm telling you to return it to its habitat and allow natural processes to take their course. If you don't comply voluntarily, we'll have to send officers to retrieve the animal, and you could face federal charges." The call ended with Jake promising to consider his options, but he knew he couldn't do what they were asking. Not yet, anyway. The cub was still too weak to survive even one night alone in the wild, and the weather forecast called for temperatures to drop into the 40s, potentially fatal for a dehydrated young animal. That night, Jake made a decision that would change everything. Instead of returning to his hotel in Kalispell, he drove to the remote cabin he'd been renting for his photography project. It was a small, rustic place about 20 miles from the nearest neighbor, with no cell phone service and only a landline for emergencies. He set up a makeshift den for the cub in his bathroom, using every towel and blanket he could find to create a warm, comfortable nest. He offered more water and was encouraged when the little bear drank eagerly from a shallow bowl he'd improvised from a camping plate. But Jake knew that water alone wouldn't be enough. Bear cubs rely on their mother's rich, fatty milk for the first several months of life. He needed to find a suitable substitute, and he needed to find it fast. The nearest town was 40 minutes away over winding mountain roads, but Jake made the drive that night, buying every can of high-fat evaporated milk the small grocery store had in stock, along with some vitamin supplements and a set of baby bottles. When he returned to the cabin near midnight, he found the cub exactly where he'd left it, curled up in the nest of blankets and sleeping peacefully for the first time in who knows how long. Over the next 3 weeks, Jake's life became a 24-hour cycle of feeding, cleaning, and caring for the bear cub he'd started calling Rocky, partly because of where he'd found him, and partly because the little bear had shown such incredible resilience in the face of impossible odds. The improvised milk formula seemed to work. Rocky gained weight rapidly, growing from barely 15 pounds to almost 30 pounds. His coat became glossy and full, his eyes bright and alert. He played with makeshift toys Jake created from cardboard boxes and rope, and he followed Jake around the cabin like a furry, clumsy shadow. But even as Jake marveled at Rocky's development, he was tormented by the knowledge that this arrangement couldn't last. Every day he kept the cub was another day that Rocky was losing his natural fear of humans and his instinct to survive in the wild. He had seen too many well-meaning rescues that ultimately ended in tragedy for the animal involved. He spent hours researching wildlife rehabilitation centers, but the nearest facility equipped to handle a grizzly cub was over 400 miles away in Wyoming, and they were already at capacity for the season. The other option was to turn Rocky over to Montana Fish Wildlife Parks, but Jake knew that would likely mean euthanasia. The state rarely invested the time and resources needed to successfully rehabilitate and release grizzly cubs, especially ones that had been in human contact. Meanwhile, Jake documented everything. His photographer's instincts kicked in, and he found himself capturing hundreds of images and hours of video of Rocky's development. The little bear was incredibly photographic, playful, expressive, and seemingly always ready to pose for the camera. It was during the 3rd week that Jake started to notice something troubling. Rocky was becoming increasingly anxious whenever Jake left the cabin, even for short periods. The cub would cry and pace, scratching at the door and windows until Jake returned. This wasn't just normal attachment behavior. It was the kind of deep dependency that would make it nearly impossible for Rocky to survive on his own. Jake realized he was facing a deadline. Soon, Rocky would be too big and too humanized to have any chance of successful release into the wild. But he was also too young and dependent to survive if Jake simply returned him to the forest. It was a catch-22 that kept Jake awake at night, staring at the ceiling while Rocky slept peacefully in his improvised den. Then on a Tuesday morning in early August, everything changed. Jake was outside the cabin chopping firewood while Rocky was playing in a small fenced area he'd constructed when he heard the sound that made his blood run cold. The distinctive woof of an adult grizzly bear calling to her cubs. He dropped the axe and turned toward the forest, scanning the tree line with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years in grizzly country. At first, he saw nothing. Then, about 200 yards away, partially hidden behind a cluster of aspen trees, he spotted her. She was a magnificent female grizzly, probably around 350 pounds, with the distinctive shoulder hump and dished face profile that marked her as a mature adult. Her coat was a rich brown with silver-tipped guard hairs that caught the morning sunlight. She stood on her hind legs, testing the air with her sensitive nose, clearly investigating the unfamiliar scents around the cabin. Rocky had heard her too.
The cub's entire demeanor changed instantly. He stood up on his hind legs, mimicking the adult bear's posture, and made a series of soft chirping sounds that Jake had never heard him make before. Jake's heart pounded as he realized what was happening. This could be Rocky's mother. The timing made sense. It had been almost a month since he'd found the cub, and if she'd been injured or trapped somewhere, she might have finally recovered enough to return to the area where she'd left him. But there was also a terrifying possibility that this was a different female entirely, one who might see Rocky as a threat to her own cubs or even as a potential meal. Female grizzlies were known to be cannibalistic toward cubs that weren't their own, especially during times when food was scarce. Jake moved slowly toward the fence where Rocky was standing, keeping his eyes on the adult bear. She had dropped back down to all fours and was moving closer, her massive head swaying from side to side as she followed the complex mixture of scents that must have been confusing her. Her cub scent mixed with human scent and the artificial smells of the cabin. "Easy, girl," Jake whispered, though he knew she was still too far away to hear him. "I'm not going to hurt him. I've been taking care of him." The female bear stopped about 100 yards from the cabin and stood up again, this time getting a clear view of Rocky in his enclosure. What happened next was one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking things Jake had ever witnessed. The adult bear made a low, rumbling sound, not a growl, but something softer and more melodic. Rocky immediately responded with excited chirping sounds, bouncing up and down in the enclosure like an overexcited puppy. The communication between them was unmistakable. This wasn't just any adult female, this was his mother. For several minutes, mother and cub called back and forth to each other across the clearing. Rocky became increasingly agitated, pacing along the fence line and looking back and forth between his mother and Jake as if asking for permission to go to her. Jake found himself caught in an emotional whirlwind. Part of him was overjoyed that Rocky's mother had returned, that the little bear might have a chance at a normal life in the wild after all. But another part of him was terrified of what came next. How was he going to safely reunite them? What if the mother associated him with taking her cub and attacked? What if Rocky's time in captivity had changed him too much for him to successfully reintegrate with his mother? For the next hour, Jake watched from inside the cabin as mother and cub continued their long-distance conversation. The female bear had settled down at the edge of the clearing, lying in the shade of a large pine tree, but keeping her eyes fixed on the enclosure where Rocky was being held. He knew he had to make a decision, and he had to make it soon. The longer this standoff continued, the more agitated both bears were becoming. Rocky was now throwing himself against the fence, desperate to reach his mother, while she was beginning to pace and show signs of frustration. Using his satellite phone, Jake called Dr. Sarah Martinez, a wildlife biologist he'd worked with on several photography projects. She specialized in bear behavior and had been involved in numerous successful cub reunification efforts. "Jake, this is incredibly dangerous. You have no idea what that female's state of mind is. She may have already written off that cub as dead and moved on emotionally. Seeing him again could trigger unpredictable behavior. But what if it works? What if they can be reunited? Isn't that worth the risk?" "The risk to you, maybe, but what about the risk to the cub? If the reunification fails, if she rejects him or attacks him, he'll be traumatized. And if she accepts him but he can't readjust to life in the wild because of his time with you, you'll have condemned him to a slow death from starvation or predation." Jake looked out the window at Rocky, who was now standing on his hind legs with his paws pressed against the fence, staring at his mother with desperate longing. "I have to try," he said finally. "I can't live with myself if I don't at least give them a chance." Dr. Martinez was quiet for a long moment. "If you're going to do this, you need to do it right. First, you need to minimize your scent on the cub as much as possible. Second, you need to create a controlled release situation where the cub can choose to go to her, but can also retreat if things go wrong. And third, you need to be prepared to intervene if the situation becomes dangerous for either animal." Following her instructions, Jake spent the rest of the morning preparing for the reunion attempt. He stopped handling Rocky directly, instead using long-handled tools to provide food and water. He moved the portable fence panels to create a corridor that led from Rocky's current enclosure toward the forest, with multiple escape routes built in. Most importantly, he positioned himself with a clear line of sight and access to his truck, ready to make noise or create a distraction if the reunion went badly. As the afternoon sun began to sink lower in the sky, Jake took a deep breath and opened the gate to Rocky's enclosure. Rocky didn't immediately run toward his mother. Instead, he took a few tentative steps out of the enclosure, then looked back at Jake with an expression that seemed to ask for permission to go to her. It was a moment that broke Jake's heart. The little bear had become so dependent on human approval that he was seeking it even in this most natural of situations. "Go on, little guy. Go to your mama," Jake whispered, from his position near the truck. As if he understood, Rocky turned back toward the forest and began walking slowly across the clearing. The female bear had stood up when she saw him emerge from the enclosure, and she too began walking forward, closing the distance between them. Jake held his breath as mother and cub approached each other. Everything he'd read about bear behavior suggested that the next few minutes would determine whether this reunion was a miracle or a tragedy. They met in the middle of the clearing, about 50 yards from where Jake was watching. The female bear immediately began sniffing Rocky intensively, running her nose over every inch of his body. She was reading the story of where he'd been and what had happened to him through scent, and undoubtedly detecting the strong human odors that covered him. For a terrifying moment, she reared back and made a sound that was part growl, part confusion. Rocky had frozen in place, sensing his mother's uncertainty. Jake's hand moved toward the truck's horn, ready to create a distraction if the situation went south. But then something remarkable happened. The female bear seemed to look past the confusing sense and recognize something deeper. Her own cub alive and healthy despite everything that had happened. She made a soft chuffing sound and gently nudged Rocky with her massive head. Rocky responded with the same chirping sounds Jake had heard him make as a tiny cub. He pressed against his mother's side and began the nursing behavior that all bear cubs use to stimulate milk production. The female bear lowered herself to the ground and rolled slightly onto her side, allowing Rocky to nurse for the first time in over a month. Jake found himself crying as he watched the reunion unfold. After weeks of worrying about whether he'd done the right thing, whether Rocky would ever be able to return to the wild, he was witnessing something that felt nothing short of miraculous. But even as he celebrated this victory, he knew that the real test was still to come. Would Rocky be able to readjust to life in the wild? Would his mother be able to teach him the survival skills he'd missed during his time in captivity? Would they be able to find enough food and water to survive the rest of the drought? Mother and cub spent the rest of the evening near the clearing, giving Jake the opportunity to observe their interactions from a respectful distance. What he saw was both encouraging and heartbreaking. Rocky was clearly overjoyed to be reunited with his mother, but it was also obvious that his time in captivity had changed him. He was less cautious than a wild cub should be, less attentive to the subtle signals his mother was giving him about potential dangers in the environment. When she froze and tested the air for scents, Rocky continued playing. When she moved into a defensive posture at the sound of a distant branch breaking, Rocky seemed oblivious. Most concerning to Jake was Rocky's continued attention to him. Several times during the evening, the cub looked back toward the cabin and made soft calling sounds, as if inviting Jake to join them. His mother clearly didn't understand or approve of this behavior, nudging Rocky away from the cabin area and toward the forest. As darkness fell, Jake watched through his telephoto lens as the female bear began leading Rocky away from the clearing and into the deeper forest. Every instinct told Jake to follow them, to continue documenting this incredible story. But he knew that the best thing he could do for both bears was to let them go. That night, Jake lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest, hoping to hear some sign that mother and cub were nearby and doing well. But the woods were silent, except for the usual chorus of insects and the distant call of an owl. The next morning, Jake found their tracks leading away from the clearing and toward the higher elevations, where food and water would be more plentiful. Mixed in with the distinctive paw prints of the adult female and the smaller prints of Rocky, Jake found something that made his heart swell with hope, evidence that they had been foraging together. Overturned logs and disturbed ground showed that the mother bear was already teaching Rocky how to search for grubs and roots. For the next 3 days, Jake remained at the cabin, hoping for another glimpse of the reunited family. He documented the tracks and signs he found around the clearing, creating a record of their movements and behavior, but he never saw them again. On the 4th day, Jake packed up his deer and prepared to return to Denver. As he loaded his truck, he felt a mixture of pride and profound sadness. He'd saved Rocky's life and successfully reunited him with his mother, something that wildlife experts had told him was nearly impossible. But he also knew that he might never know whether the story had a truly happy ending. 3 months later, Jake was back in Glacier National Park for a follow-up assignment, documenting the recovery of wildlife populations after the summer's drought had finally broken. He wasn't specifically looking for Rocky and his mother, but he couldn't help scanning every group of bears he encountered, hoping to spot a familiar face. It was during his second week in the field that he got the encounter he'd been secretly hoping for. Jake was photographing a group of bears feeding on salmon in a creek about 10 miles from where he'd originally found Rocky. The autumn salmon run had been particularly good this year, and bears were taking advantage of the abundant protein to build up fat reserves for winter hibernation. Through his telephoto lens, Jake was focusing on a large male grizzly when he noticed movement in his peripheral vision. A female bear with a cub was approaching the creek from the opposite bank. Something about the way they moved together caught his attention, and he swung his camera toward them. The moment he got them in focus, Jake's heart stopped. The cub was bigger now, probably close to 60 pounds, and his coat had taken on the darker coloration of a juvenile bear. But those eyes, that distinctive white patch on his chest that Jake had memorized during their weeks together, were unmistakable. It was Rocky! Jake watched in amazement as the young bear demonstrated perfect wild behavior. He stayed close to his mother, mimicked her fishing techniques, and showed appropriate caution around the larger male bears sharing the creek. There was no sign of the human-dependent behavior that Jake had worried so much during their reunion. But the most incredible moment was still to come. As Jake continued photographing, Rocky's mother began moving along the creek bank in his direction. She was following the natural path that would bring her within about 50 yards from where Jake was positioned, hidden behind a large boulder with his camera. When she reached the closest point to Jake's hiding spot, she stopped and stood up on her hind legs, looking directly at him. Even through the telephoto lens, Jake could see her intelligent eyes studying him, clearly recognizing his scent and remembering their previous encounter. For a moment, Jake was terrified. This was exactly the kind of situation that wildlife experts warned about, a bear that had learned to associate humans with her cub, potentially creating a dangerous situation for future encounters. But instead of showing aggression, the female bear did something that took Jake's breath away. She made a soft chuffing sound, not a threat, but the same gentle noise she'd made during Rocky's reunion. Then she looked at Rocky, who was still focused on trying to catch fish, and back at Jake. It was unmistakable. She was showing him that her cub was safe, healthy, and thriving. Then she dropped back down to all fours, nudged Rocky away from the creek, and led him into the forest without looking back. That evening, back at his campsite, Jake sat by the fire reviewing the photographs he had taken of Rocky and his mother. The images told an incredible story of successful rehabilitation and family reunion, but they also raised profound questions about the relationship between humans and wildlife. Jake had broken federal law by taking Rocky from the wild. He'd risked his career, his freedom, and potentially his life. Wildlife officials would argue that he'd interfered with natural processes and could have created a dangerous situation for both humans and bears. But looking at the photographs of a healthy, wild Rocky learning to fish with his mother, Jake knew he'd made the right choice. Sometimes, compassion required breaking rules. Sometimes, doing what was right meant risking everything. Over the next few days, Jake continued to spot Rocky and his mother around the Salmon Creek. Each time he documented their behavior and was consistently amazed by how completely Rocky had readjusted to life in the wild. The little bear who had once been dependent on human care was now thriving in his natural habitat, learning the complex survival skills that would carry him through adulthood. On his final day in the park, Jake had an encounter that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Jake was packing up his camera equipment after a morning of photographing the autumn landscape when he heard familiar sounds coming from the forest behind him. The soft chuffing and chirping sounds of bears communicating with each other were distinctive, and Jake had learned to recognize the specific vocalizations that Rocky and his mother used. He turned around slowly, keeping his movements calm and predictable, and found himself face to face with both bears at a distance of about 30 yards. They had approached him deliberately, moving through the forest with the quiet confidence that only wild animals possess. Rocky's mother stood slightly ahead of her cub in a protective but not aggressive posture. She was watching Jake carefully, but there was no fear in her eyes, only a kind of recognition and, if Jake was reading her correctly, gratitude. Rocky himself had grown enormously since their reunion 3 months earlier. He now looked like a proper juvenile bear with the sturdy build and confident demeanor that would carry him through his first winter hibernation. But when he looked at Jake, there was still a flicker of the connection they had shared during those crucial weeks at the cabin. For several minutes, the three of them simply looked at each other across the clearing. Jake felt a profound sense of completion, as if a story that had begun with a desperate rescue was finally reaching its proper conclusion. Then Rocky did something that brought tears to Jake's eyes. The young bear stood up on his hind legs, a behavior that Jake remembered from their early days together, and made a soft, chirping sound that sounded remarkably like goodbye. His mother watched this interaction with what appeared to be approval, then gently nudged Rocky back down to all fours, and together they turned and walked back into the forest, leaving Jake alone with his cameras and his memories. When Jake returned to Denver, he faced a difficult decision about what to do with the hundreds of photographs and hours of video he had captured during Rocky's rescue and rehabilitation. The images were some of the most powerful wildlife documentation he'd ever created, but sharing them publicly would mean admitting to federal crimes and potentially exposing the location where Rocky and his mother were living. After weeks of agonizing over the decision, Jake chose to share the story. He felt that the educational value and the message of hope it could provide outweighed the personal risks he faced. The response was overwhelming. Wildlife biologists, conservationists, and animal lovers around the world were amazed by the documentation of a successful bear cub reunification. Many experts had believed such a reunion was impossible, especially after the cub had spent significant time in human care. But the story also sparked important conversations about wildlife management, the ethics of human intervention,